The stock issue known as harms is the portion of the debate round where the affirmative team tries to prove that the problem in the status quo is harmful, and where the negative team tries to disprove that the problem in the status quo is harmful. Each side needs good evidence to support their claims. Since harms is a stock issue, that means that the affirmative team has the burden of proof and must prove that the harms in the status quo are severe enough to justify the proposed affirmative plan. If the affirmative team fails to prove harms, then the plan is not justified. Unlike the stock issue of inherency, where the affirmative must prove that the problem is stuck in the status quo, the stock issue of harms focuses on the undesirable impacts of the problem. Inherency means the problem exists. Harms means the problem is bad. It's really important that we talk about the difference between a problem and a harm, because a lot of teams confuse the two concepts. Let's use our surveillance debate as an example. If the affirmative team were to claim that the NSA can access our cell phone metadata, is that a problem, a harm, or neither? Well, at this point, it's neither. Although it may be true that the NSA can access our cell phone metadata, the affirmative team hasn't given us any evidence that it's a problem, nor have they shown any harmful impacts resulting from the metadata collection itself. Sure, you might think it's a problem, but without evidence, there's a leap in logic because the affirmative team wants us to assume that there are problems and harms that stem from the government access to our cell phone metadata. So what if the affirmative team took it one step further and said that the metadata from our phone records allows the government to track our movement and seize our information without a warrant? Have they now proven that accessing our metadata is a problem yet? I think you could make the argument that this could be harmful to us, but you could also argue that such surveillance is as helpful as it is harmful. The important thing here is that the affirmative team can't just assume that a problem is harmful. There must be proof and analysis as to why it's harmful. There are two ways in which teams can discuss harms: quantitative harms and qualitative harms. These come from the root words quantity, meaning the number of times an undesirable effect happens, and quantity, meaning the severity of an undesirable effect. A quantitative harm is one in which the frequency or number of times an undesirable effect happens, and it's unnecessarily high. Using the surveillance example, 91% of NSA data comes from the PRISM software. That number, 91%, is a quantitative harms. So are the number of Americans who are harmed by the collecting of the software. These are all examples of quantitative harms. It's important to note that these numbers are somewhat meaningless unless they are presented in context. So the evidence used by the affirmative team to prove their claim needs to be more than just raw numbers. It needs to go a step further and present those numbers in context. Are they increasing? And if so, by what percent? At what point do these numbers become unacceptably high? If you're starting to guess that affirmative team really needs to find specific evidence to prove your harms, you're right. And since the affirmative team has a long time to research and build their case, whereas the negative team only has a few minutes to examine and respond to the affirmative team's case, the burden is on the affirmative to really prove the undesirable effects of the status quo and that they are harmful. Quantitative harms are great for proving the harms in the status quo through numbers. But what if numbers don't tell the entire story? What if you can't really understand the problem unless you look beyond the numbers? So let's take a look and move on to qualitative harms, where the focus shifts away from the numbers and we talk instead about the severity of the problem. Oftentimes, the problems in our world can't be measured in numbers, and we need a way to understand that some problems are worth addressing, even if the frequency of the problem doesn't appear to be immediately significant. In 2013, a woman discovered that the NSA, as part of the PRISM software program, had monitored her cell phone. And while quantitatively it's only one person, which makes it seem rather insignificant, the woman happened to be Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, and she was not happy about it at all. So even one instance can become qualitatively significant if the context makes it significant. There are two more points we need to discuss about harms. The first is the difference between harms and advantages. So let's spend a couple of minutes thinking like an affirmative team. Many affirmative teams will discover that there are a lot of different harms associated with the status quo, and their plan solves for some or all of them. So, for example, if your plan reduces the unemployment rate, you might be solving for the harms of housing foreclosures, welfare recipients, homelessness, and economic stability. You could try to pack all of those harms into your affirmative case, but that would mean you'd spend a whole lot of time describing the problem and not enough time describing the solution. Even more importantly, your affirmative case must absolutely, positively, certainly, and definitely solve for all the harms you describe. So if you describe 4 harms in the status quo, your affirmative plan has to solve for all 4 harms. That makes it easier for the negative team to win because all they have to do is disprove that your case solves for even one of those 4 harms. The affirmative team can't claim that there are only 4 problems, but they only solve for 3 of them, because that makes the affirmative plan look like it doesn't solve the problem you described. So really smart affirmative teams pick the harm they know they can solve for sure, and magically repackage the remaining harms into advantages. So let's go back to our example of the 4 harms of housing foreclosures, welfare recipients, homelessness, and economic stability. If you're the affirmative team, maybe you think you are most likely to solve for economic stability. That's the one you feel most confident about solving. The remaining harms can be repackaged as advantages. Now, we haven't talked about advantages yet in this video series, so here's a preview. Advantages are the reason why the affirmative plan will make the world an even better place, even better than without the affirmative plan. And the affirmative team will introduce 3 or 4 advantages during the 1AC. So, using our example above, our harm is economic stability, which the affirmative plan solves for. And our first advantage is a reduction in housing foreclosures. Our second advantage is a reduction in welfare recipients. And our third advantage is reducing homelessness. This is a very smart idea, strategically speaking, because advantages aren't stock issues. And so there is no burden of proof on the affirmative to prove that they will win all of their advantages. In other words, if the affirmative team says that there are 4 harms, then they have to prove that they can solve all 4 harms. But if the affirmative team says that there are 3 advantages, then even if the affirmative only wins one of those 3 advantages, that's still better than the status quo. So the affirmative team can still win the round. Another similar strategy is to spend more time talking about all the good things about your plan and spend less time talking about all the bad things in the status quo. And this may make a difference in how you arrange your harms versus advantages. Think about a 30-second commercial. The first 5 to 10 seconds are spent describing the problem, and the remaining 20 to 25 seconds are spent describing how wonderful life is once the solution is in place. The same is true for the first affirmative constructive. The time you spend talking about inherency and harms should be kept to a minimum so that you can maximize the amount of time you spend showing all the advantages. So you may want to consider how long it will take to make your harms argument. If you have a complicated harm like privacy or Fourth Amendment and you need to spend a lot of time talking about search and seizure, you may want to turn it into an advantage rather than a harm, even if you think it's one of your most compelling harms. So that's all you need to know about harms. Here are the key terms you'll want to remember. Harms, stock issue, quantitative harms, qualitative harms, harms versus advantages. And remember to really look closely at whether the affirmative harms argument truly describes a problem, a harm, or neither. That's all for now. Good luck, debaters.